Please welcome back to the stage, Karla Murthy. So we, as you can see, we have a QR code and a URL up there for you to submit questions. So please feel free to use that. We'll get to as many audience questions as we can. But first, I just want to start out by asking. This is a movie, you know, it's made up of footage shot over a great many years, and not just some of it shot by you, some of it shot by others. But just speaking for yourself. Kind of at what point, what did you realize or did you determine that now I'm making a project like this is not just footage, you know, home movies per se anymore, but this is part of something else that you're going to share?
First, I just want to thank you all for coming, and also just that there are so many like texts and references that only this audience would get. So anyway, I just hope you all saw some of the texts in there. So yeah, it was a long process. So I had recorded those conversations with my dad many, many years ago, and that story of him, you know, how he came to the States was a story that we had all heard many, many times growing up as a kid. And so when I recorded them, I was like, he used a lot of the same language about how he came to, you know, the United States. But this time in the context of the gas station, it sounded so differently to me for the first time. I kind of like to equate it to, you know, when you know a song and you know the lyrics so well and you're not really thinking about what they mean until one day you're like, oh, wait a second, this is a really sad song. I had one of those moments when we were recording those conversations because now it was to, you know, the sounds of the cash register and, you know, someone interrupting him, you know, to his story to buy cigarettes, and it started making me rethink his story. It wasn't this like fairy tale story anymore. But I didn't do anything with those tapes for a really, really long time. And I think it took I tried actually, but I think it took me living and working and having a family of my own, finding my own voice. I mentioned earlier I worked in news for a long time, and being comfortable, you know, recording myself. And then also, obviously, his passing that kind of made me go back to those tapes. But it took me a while, and it was a very organic process. I just started kind of playing around with footage and listening to his voice again. I think the first thing I actually made was just a collage of looking like when I heard him say the thing about, like, I was dreaming, I was back in India, you know, I was in India, and playing around with, you know, gas station footage was one of the first things I made and then, like, mixing in these layers of sunrises, and I was like, ooh, this is kind of cool, like to create this sort of portal. So yeah, it was a very, very organic process, though.
And you mentioned the story of you know, how your father came to the U.S. and this is we had some discussions about this kind of internally, like in the context of like spoilers. You kind of withhold that until like a fairly late point in the movie. It's not like a linear story where you're starting with, you know, your father's childhood and then he comes to us. How did you kind of arrive at that sort of structure? Because it's very sort of non-linear.
Yes. You know, I kind of like to call this sort of a memory film, and I wanted it to feel like a visual sort of diary or journal, which is, and also when you're in a state of grief and thinking about someone that you love, it's not linear at all. It's, and I wanted to embrace all the different formats of footage and kind of just collage it all together. But the only thing that is chronological is his story of how he came to the U.S. So I call them these dream sequences, and that story is the only thing that's purely chronological. But yeah, I was really influenced by this memory researcher out at Stanford, and he equates memory being more like a painting than a photograph, and that you can revisit a painting or a subject of a painting over and over again and paint it differently based on who you are, where you are at that moment in time. And so I really kind of embraced that idea, and this film is really capturing one moment in time of how I was feeling about my dad and his life I know I always like to say that like one of my siblings is here, but we would all make completely different films about my dad. I would make a different film if I were older or younger, and that was something that really weighed on me too, is that we tend to look at these films about people as like these definitive stories of someone's life, and I didn't want it to have that feeling at all. We are filled with infinite amount of stories and truths that are conflicting, and I kind of wanted it to feel like something that wasn't definitive, but this sort of state of grief, and me trying to kind of figure out who my dad was by revisiting some of these moments in his life and in my life too.
When you're putting together a film like this, that's a highly personal film, it's on the one hand, it's your film, but you as you normally do, you have collaborators working with you. How do you kind of convey these very sort of personal feelings and sentiments to somebody who is maybe, perhaps a close collaborator, but who has not, been through these same experiences? And how do you kind of work with them to create something that's apropos for this very personal story that you're telling?
That was really difficult. So I wasn't originally planning on editing the film. I had an editor who was working with me, Pekka Passalar, and we started working together, I just realized it wasn't, I set her up for an impossible task, because a lot of this footage was never meant to be in a film. It's messy, it's incomplete, and so I ended up editing it myself. And one of the reasons also, because it was so personal, it felt like someone was rummaging through my personal things and we're putting it out to discuss. That was really hard for me. But one of the things I do like to say to people who are filmmakers is that you should make one personal project in your life, or film, or just even if it's a short, because it was a very humbling process to know what it feels like to have your life, put onto note cards and pinned up on a board and rearranged and shoved into a 3-act structure. I feel like going through that process has definitely made me a better filmmaker going forward. But I had an amazing team, and because I was editing it myself, I had two, just exceptional and supportive consulting editors that worked with me. My producer, Rajal Petroda, was also just so supportive of my process, because it was very different than other films that I've made. So I think having that kind of team to kind of support me was crucial.
I want to ask about one collaborator in particular, because your own kind of background and your history with music. You did work with a composer on this film, I understand, a Texan composer, Texas-based at least. Can you talk about that collaboration?
Yeah. So my composer, who I love, Babak Lapaport, he actually composed along with Casey Trela, his collaborator. They composed the music for my first film. And Babak had been visiting New York, and I was like, I have this idea for a film. My dad was a gas station attendant, and Babak was like, my dad was too. And he grew up in Texas, in Denton, and he's half Iranian, half Mexican. And so, we had made a pact right then and there. If I made this film, you would have to make the music. And it was such an amazing, I think also it helped that I do come from a music background, but the references that I gave him, I wanted, first of all, for him to bring his own background into the film. So there's the santur is also a precursor of the piano. I also gave him music from Mindanao. Actually, my sister and her husband at their wedding, and actually the musicians, is Koi still here, and Ramal, they played this music that always stuck with me from Mindanao boat music. And so I remembered that, and I gave him some of that music to listen to. So there's a lot of this gamelan sound, especially at the beginning of the film. After Sun was another film that I gave him as a reference, but it was such an amazing collaborator. And just a quick story, we had to delay post-production so that he and his partner and his toddler could move into their new home in Altadena in California. And he finished the score in his home music studio, and then lost everything in the Eaton fire. And so this film is very special for both of us because it has so many of the instruments that he lost, but he was able to save the Suntour and those Gamelon strips. So we're having a special screening in LA this summer at the Lumley in Glendale, which is close to Altadena, and he's going to play those two instruments at that performance. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Let's I'm going to turn it over to the audience. We have the first question here from Kim. Your dad had many different jobs throughout his life. Why did you choose the title, the gas station attendant?
There are a few reasons for that. One is that like those phone recordings I had were while he was working at a gas station. But I think also as I was thinking about the world that this film was going to come into and be born into, and the climate that we're in, I kept thinking about like our relation to, immigrant labor, and how they are these invisible kind of intimate strangers in our lives. So the gas station attendants, the convenience store clerks, the taxi drivers, we don't know their names, but we like entrust our lives to them to, drive us around. We see them every day. And I kept thinking like, oh, what if I can get people to get to know this person? This person is all of, my dad's story is everyone's story who does this kind of, it's we all have these kinds of stories. And what if I can get people to get to know this person so intimately that, they grieve his death? And I think it creates so much empathy, or I hope I've created empathy for someone like my dad, because I feel like we need so much empathy right now in the world. So that was one of the reasons why I chose to call it that.
I have a question here from Vivian. How did you make sense of all of your father's business ventures, and do you feel like you're closer to understanding his motivations?
Yeah, that was sort of the reason why I was making this film, is to kind of become closer to him. And while I was making it, it was one of the realizations I had is that, like, I always thought, like, oh, he's just not disciplined, or, like, what is going on? Like, does he just have bad luck? But when I really started to understand what his childhood was like and really try to imagine that, what it meant for him to be able to survive as a child, a 10-year-old on the streets of India, it meant he had to keep moving. It meant he had to, like, if a job didn't work out, he had to find another one or he would starve. And I think those kinds of experiences when you're young like that really imprint themselves on you. And it never really occurred to me that those things could be related. I'll never know the definitive answer to that. And this film for me is not about finding definitive answers. It's also about living with unanswered questions. Because that's just part of life too, and just being able to find peace with that, with all the unanswered questions that I still have. It's also, so the very last piece that I play, you might miss the title, but it's called Unsent Love Letters, and those pieces were written as an homage to Eric Satie, who's a French composer, and when he died, they went into his apartment in Paris, and they found a stack of unsent love letters. And so this film is like my unsent love letter to my dad, because I didn't get to say so many of the things that I wanted to say. It's also my, plea to you all to send those love letters as well.
That's actually a good segue into this question from Lizzie, which is, what is something that you wish you had been able to ask or even just learn about your father?
Oh my gosh, there's so many things. I think I would want to know, like, what was it? I kind of wish I had asked a lot more questions about his childhood and not just stuck with, like, the same story that he kept taking and asked that, like, follow-up question, and because all I have is, I wanted to treat those recordings as, like, source material. I wasn't going to try and interpret them in any, like, just try and fill in a lot of the blanks. So I wish I kind of asked a lot more questions about his childhood, and just, that's one of the things I definitely wanted to know more about.
I have a question from Anonymous, which, with your interpretation of your father, how have you reconciled your siblings' narrative of who he was with what your reality was?
We haven't, I mean, I'm not even sure exactly what my siblings' narrative would be. They all came to the
they
last.
haven't made that movie yet.
They haven't made that movie yet. I was joking at our last screening, because they were all at the screening in Houston. That was a very overwhelming and intense experience, because also the kids and grandkids of Leo and Faye Kern, who brought our dad here, were in the audience as well. So it was just an incredible experience. But I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying before, like, you're just made up of all these different stories, and they can all be true. And my oldest sister, who's here, remembers probably more the good times, you know, when we were in Seattle than I do. So it's like we would all tell really different stories about my dad.
As you went through all of this is an audience question from Anonymous, but as you went through these archives of the family footage, was there a particular moment of footage that was the most sort of emotional for you to watch again?
I don't know if there was one thing, because you could just, like, there were moments where, like, I would freeze a frame and it would just bring up so much for me. And there's actually some takes in the, like, audio, like, I would record narration right into the timeline and then play around with footage, and some of it I was actually like crying and recording. I left some of those takes in, but I think, yeah, there was a lot that that brought up. I mean, like, just little bits of footage would then, like, trigger something else for me. Like I was like looking at our Disneyland footage of my, like, dad on that boat with my little brother, and then all of a sudden I kept thinking about, like, oh, it's like he's charting this new way forward, and I wrote this whole thing. So yeah, I don't know if there was like one particular thing, but I do, there's a part in the film where I talk about it's such a, it's a time traveling gift to be able to see your parents and the places that made them. And being able to, like, look at the footage of my mom in India and how happy she was, and with her siblings and that landscape, that really was just so moving to me, because it's like all of a sudden the puzzle pieces start to click together when you see your parents in these places. And it actually reminded me something that my husband told me, who's from Lebanon, and when his grandmother came to the States, like, I met her and she was very stoic and quiet and she was always in mourning, like in black. And then he went with her to Lebanon, and it was like she was a completely different person, like bubbly and entertaining everyone and offering people plates of, you know, the cigarettes and treats and all these things, and she became a completely different person. And that story really stuck with me as I was watching some of the footage of my parents back in their homeland.
I think we'll close this out with a question that I'm sure a lot of people here are wondering about, which is if we wanted to share this film with others, how or when will we be able to do that?
So for the rest of July, we'll be doing more theatrical screenings, but then we will have our national broadcast premiere on POV on PBS starting August 3rd. So
thank you for the wonderful film, for being here with it, and for sharing it with the audience here in Austin. This is something, you know, as I said at the introduction, that, you know, we have been looking forward to, you know, for a long time, and we're happy that we can be part of the your sort of festival and, you know, touring journey with this film, and hopefully also whatever you do in the future.
thank you.
And
Thank you so much.
and if you have any questions that, you know, we didn't get to, you know, you'll be in the lobby afterwards. So, okay, all right. So thank you for coming, and hope to see you for the rest of our screenings today. Thank you to Karla.